the Knickerbocker Storm of 1922. On January 27, 1922, Washington, D.C. was struck by the heaviest snowstorm in its history, 28 inches 71 centimeters of snow in just 24 hours, a record that still stands today. But it wasn't just the storm that marked that day, it was the collapse of the Knickerbocker Theatre, where 98 people died and 133 others were injured when tons of snow, steel, and concrete crashed down on an audience of over 900 people. In this video, you will discover what it was like to live in that era, the fatal engineering flaws that caused the tragedy, and the true stories of survivors and victims. A story of snow, blood, arrogance, and accountability that forever changed building codes in the United States. Prepare for a journey back in time to one of the most tragic nights in American history. Have you ever stopped to consider what it truly means to be trapped? I'm not talking about prisons with iron bars. I'm talking about that kind of entrapment where you are surrounded by people, laughing, enjoying life, and suddenly the world collapses on you. Literally. Where fun turns into a nightmare in a fraction of a second, and all you can do is wait beneath tons of steel and snow, breathing dwindling air, listening to screams all around you. It sounds like something out of a horror movie, right? But it's not fiction. This actually happened just over 100 years ago, on a Friday night, like any other, right in the capital of the United States. And the worst part, it could have been prevented. Do you know that feeling when you are comfortable, safe, and suddenly realize that safety was an illusion? That is exactly what 900 people felt on January 27, 1922, when the sky dumped the largest snowstorm Washington, D.C. had ever seen, and the ceiling of the Knickerbocker Theatre collapsed on top of them. It wasn't just the snow that killed 98 people that night, it was arrogance, negligence, and the rush to build something impressive without considering the consequences. And this raises a disturbing question that still resonates today. How many other structures around us, how many other places we consider safe, hide fatal flaws waiting for the right moment to reveal their true nature? This is the story of the Knickerbocker Storm, of the biggest U.S. snowstorm of 1922, what it was like to live in that era, and how one night of entertainment became the worst urban nightmare that city had ever witnessed. A story of snow, steel, blood, and accountability. And I guarantee you will never look at a ceiling the same way again. And if you enjoy true stories from the past that no one tells, hit the like button now, and subscribe to the channel, turning on notifications. Comment below. Would you have the courage to walk into that theater? Now, let's get to the story. It was January 27, 1922, and Washington, D.C. woke up under a gray sky that seemed to carry the weight of the world. People that Friday morning hurried along the stone sidewalks, wrapped in thick wool coats and stiff hats, as the biting January cold nipped at their faces. No one imagined that in the next 24 hours, the sky would unleash something the capital had never seen before. And that would forever change how that city viewed winter. The temperature had plummeted brutally in the previous days, and now heavy, wet flakes began to fall, slowly, almost innocently. At that time, Washington was a city undergoing a transformation. Ford Model T automobiles competed for space on the streets, with noisy electric streetcars and tired horse-drawn carriages. Women wore long dresses down to their ankles, and men wore three-piece suits, even in the cruel cold. Electricity was still new in many neighborhoods, and homes relied on coal fireplaces for heat. Radio was starting to enter American homes, but most news still arrived via print newspapers, sold by boys on street corners, shouting headlines. And it was exactly on that day that something began to form on the horizon, a mass of cold air from Canada, colliding with warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico. Around noon, the snow was already falling heavily, and what seemed to be just another harsh winter day began to show its true face. The streets turned into unforgiving white carpets, and the flakes kept falling heavy, dense, accumulating at an alarming speed. Streetcars began to struggle to move. Automobiles skidded and slipped, and people rushed into stores, theaters, and restaurants seeking shelter. Among these places was the Knickerbocker Theatre, one of the most elegant in the city, with its domed, arched roof and capacity for over 1,000 spectators. That night, it was packed for a musical comedy performance. But outside, something invisible and deadly was piling up. Living in Washington, D.C. in early 1922 was navigating between two worlds, past still tied to Victorian traditions, and the future, knocking on the door with its machines and novelties. Families woke up before dawn to light the fireplaces, and women spent hours cooking on wood stoves, preparing oatmeal, eggs, and bacon to sustain the day. Men left for work in factories, government offices, department stores, or as construction laborers. The city was growing, skyscrapers were starting to appear, and there was work for anyone willing to put in the effort. Children walked to school, even with snow up to their knees, carrying their metal lunchboxes and books strapped with leather belts. But that winter of 1922 was proving to be particularly brutal. Poor familias, especially in working-class neighborhoods, struggled to keep their homes warm. Coal was expensive, and many slept dressed, piled under patched blankets. There was growing social tension in the city. World War I veterans, which had ended only 3 years earlier, wandered the streets looking for jobs, many of them still traumatized by the trenches of France. Women, who had tasted independence working while the men were at war, were now pressured to return home. And there was the constant fear of tuberculosis, the Spanish flu that still haunted recent memories, and epidemics that swept through entire neighborhoods without warning. On that night of January 27th, as the snow fell, people sought distraction, human warmth, something to make them forget the cold and the uncertainties. The Knickerbocker Theatre was full of wealthy families, businessmen, politicians, a former United States senator, all dressed in their best clothes, laughing at the musical comedy Gittridge. Outside, the snow was already over 1.5 feet deep, heavy as wet concrete, accumulating on roofs, canopies, electrical wires, and on the theater's arched roof. Tons and tons of wet snow began to press down on the steel beams designed with a fatal flaw that no one had yet noticed. Something strange was happening that night, and a few people noticed before the tragedy. Theater employees later reported hearing peculiar sounds coming from the ceiling during the performance: sharp snaps, low metallic groans, as if the building's structure itself was breathing with difficulty. One of the light operators even went up to inspect the attic above the auditorium and came back pale, saying he had seen the ceiling moving slightly, rippling like the surface of a lake. But no one paid much attention. After all, old buildings always make strange noises, especially in the harsh winter. Outside, on the deserted, snow-covered streets, a few people still trying to get home noticed that other roofs also seemed to be sagging under the weight. What few knew at the time was that the snow that day had rare and deadly characteristics. Due to the temperature fluctuating just above and below freezing, the flakes fell partially melted, forming. The collapse happened in a fraction of a second, but for those inside, it felt like an eternity in slow motion. The arched steel trusses, designed to distribute the weight evenly, failed at the exact point of greatest tension, the central curve. The error was in basic physics. Arched beams, without adequate support, create stress concentration points that, under extreme load, simply give way like dry branches. Tons of snow, twisted steel, concrete, and debris plummeted onto over 900 people seated in the auditorium. The noise was described by survivors as the sound of the end of the world. A deafening roar followed by screams. Then a deadly silence, punctuated only by muffled moans and sobs. The snow continued to fall through the giant hole in the roof, covering the rubble, burying the living and the dead under an indifferent white layer. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. Thousands of people began running toward the theater. Even as the storm still raged, parents looking for children, wives looking for husbands, and the curious drawn by the tragedy. The police had to call in military troops to control the growing crowd that threatened to hinder the rescues. Rescue teams faced a brutal challenge: how to remove tons of twisted steel, concrete, and snow without causing further collapses that would kill the survivors trapped underneath. When someone had an idea that seemed straight out of a contemporary science fiction novel using acetylene torches, the same newly developed technology used to weld warships during World War I. They were rare, dangerous pieces of equipment, but capable of cutting thick steel like butter. Throughout the entire night and the following day, as the snow finally stopped falling, Washington, D.C. lived its worst nightmare. The blue flames of the torches illuminated the apocalyptic scene, sparks flying in the cold air as men covered in blood, and dust cut beams to reach the muffled cries coming from beneath the rubble. Some survivors were pulled out alive, after hours of being buried. Miraculous stories of people protected by air pockets among the debris. But many others were found dead, crushed, frozen. Among the victims were former Senator Andrew J. Montague, business leaders, and entire families. In the end, 98 were killed and 133 injured. The city went into collective mourning, and investigations began immediately. What they discovered was terrifying. The days following the collapse revealed a bitter truth that would echo for decades. Investigations showed that the Knickerbocker Theatre had been built with a fatal engineering flaw. The arched steel trusses, should have been replaced by solid stone pillars. But the architect, Reginald Gear, chose the bold design to impress, to create something modern and grand. The calculations were wrong, the safety margins were inadequate, and no one had tested how that structure would behave under the weight of wet, heavy snow. When newspapers published the technical details, the public was furious. How could something like this be approved? Where were the inspectors? Who was responsible for those 98 lost lives? The weight of guilt crushed those responsible as brutally as the snow had crushed that roof. Reginald Gear, the architect, never emotionally recovered. He was sued, lost his reputation, his career, his peace. 5 years later, in 1927, he committed suicide by shooting himself in the head. Harry Crandall, the theatre owner, also couldn't bear the burden of responsibility and took his own life years later. The victims' families carried the pain forever. Children who grew up without fathers, wives who became widows in an era without social support networks, survivors who could never again enter a theater or look at snow without feeling panic. The storm left 28 inches of snow in Washington, D.C., a record that remains today, more than 100 years later. But the Knickerbocker storm left behind something beyond the snow, and the ruins it left a scar on the soul of that city, and a brutal lesson about progress and responsibility. It forever changed building codes in the United States, forced engineers to rethink how they design public structures, and showed that nature does not negotiate with human arrogance. On that night of January 27, 1922, while families laughed carelessly inside a seemingly safe theater, the sky conspired with human failures to create one of the greatest urban tragedies in American history. And even today, when heavy snow falls on Washington, D.C., some say it is still possible to hear echoes of that night, muffled screams, the cracking of steel giving way, and the deadly silence that followed. Can you imagine the terror of those people trapped under the rubble, in the darkness, with the snow still falling? Tell me in the comments which part impacted you the most, and if you know someone who should also hear this story, share this video with them. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now and turn on notifications.